going to have to eat them.
Day 10 after the crash. Those were the words that changed everything when the search was called off. You might think you know what desperation looks like, but you don't. Not until you've felt your mouth water at the sight of a friend's frozen corpse. This is the story of Eduardo, one of the survivors of that unfathomable ordeal. He was there when their group leader finally voiced what they'd all been thinking for weeks. The silence that followed wasn't shock, it was relief. This isn't just a story. It's a raw, unfiltered journey into the heart of human survival. This is the truth about how extreme hunger rewrites what it means to be human.
We're going to have to eat them. Day 10 after the crash, those were the words that changed everything when we heard the search had been called off. I'm Eduardo, and I was there when our group leader finally said what we'd all been thinking for weeks. The silence that followed wasn't shock, it was relief. We were finally admitting what our starving bodies had been screaming for days. If you think you know what desperation looks like, you don't. Not until you've felt your mouth water at the sight of your friend's frozen corpse, knowing it would taste of nothing, odorless and strange. The first bite of desperation. You think you know what it's like to be hungry, but let me tell you about the moment when your body starts eating itself from the inside out. I'm talking about a hunger so deep it reaches into your bones and starts gnawing at your very soul. Those first days after our plane crashed in the Andes, we still had hope dancing in our hearts, and a few scattered pieces of chocolate and nuts from the plane's emergency supplies. I remember holding my small portion of chocolate, breaking it into even smaller pieces, trying to make it last as long as possible. Each tiny fragment felt precious, like holding a piece of gold between my fingers. The rationing felt almost civilized at first. We divided everything equally: chocolate bars, nuts, wine, and canned goods, telling ourselves rescue would come any day. We'd sit in our makeshift shelter, passing around the meager supplies with careful precision, all of us nodding approvingly when someone took their designated portion. We were still playing by the rules of the world we'd left behind, still believing that order and fairness would somehow save us from what was coming. But I remember the exact moment when I realized my stomach wasn't just empty, it was collapsing in on itself like a deflated balloon. It happened on the fourth day when I woke up and pressed my hand against my belly, feeling something that seemed to cave inward. The sensation was so alien, so wrong, that I actually gasped out loud. The psychological shift happened faster than the physical one, and that's what caught me off guard. Suddenly every crumb became precious, every bite calculated with the precision of a mathematician. I found myself watching the others eat, counting their chews, measuring their portions with my eyes. When Roberto took what looked like a slightly larger piece of chocolate, I felt this surge of anger that scared me. This wasn't the person I'd been before the crash. Now I was becoming someone who hoarded, who calculated, who watched. What I didn't know then was that we were being prepared for something that would taste neutral to the senses, something that wouldn't overwhelm us with flavor when the time came. I started dreaming about food constantly, waking up with the taste of my mother's empanadas still lingering on my tongue. The worst part was the abrupt transition from those dream smells to the metallic taste of thin air filling my mouth when I opened my eyes to our frozen prison. My body would react to these dreams. My mouth would water, my stomach would contract with anticipation, and then the crushing disappointment would hit. The way we looked at each other began to change too, our eyes lingering a little too long on each other's faces. At first, I thought it was just concern. We were all getting thinner. our cheekbones more prominent, our eyes sunken deeper into our skulls. But there was something else in those glances, something that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't name it yet. We'd study each other's bodies with a new kind of attention, noting who was losing weight the fastest, who still had some meat on their bones. The conversations grew quieter, more careful, as if we were all afraid of saying something we couldn't take back. What I didn't know then was that this gnawing sensation was just the beginning of something much darker. The hunger wasn't just an empty feeling, it was alive, growing stronger every day, whispering things to me that I'd never imagined I could think. It started small, just fleeting thoughts about what it would be like to have real food again. But then those thoughts began to shift, to twist into something that made my hands shake. I'd catch myself staring at the others and wondering things that made me hate myself, thoughts that came from some primitive part of my brain that had been sleeping until now. The hunger wasn't just taking our strength, it was rewiring our brains, preparing us for choices we never imagined we'd make. Every day I could feel myself changing, becoming someone I didn't recognize. And as I watched my friends grow thinner each day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all becoming something else entirely. We moved differently now, our gestures more calculated, our smiles more forced. We were transforming into creatures driven by needs that civilized people weren't supposed to acknowledge. But by day 10, something far worse was happening to my body and my mind. When your body becomes the enemy. My muscles started disappearing first, not gradually like when you stop exercising, but aggressively, as if my body was cannibalizing itself to stay alive. This was what experts call hunger disease, the systematic breakdown of muscle tissue as my body consumed itself for survival. I could feel it happening, this weird sensation of my own flesh being consumed by some internal mechanism I had no control over. When I pressed my fingers against my arms, the muscle that should have been there was gone, replaced by this soft, squishy tissue that felt foreign under my skin. My hands started shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but because my body lacked fuel. The tremors weren't just in my fingers, they started in my core and radiated outward, making every movement uncertain and jerky. I'd reach for something simple, like a piece of leather we were trying to chew, and my hand would shake so violently that I'd drop it. The shaking got worse when I tried to focus on it, as if my nervous system was shorting out from starvation. My body was sending me signals I'd never experienced before, urgent messages that something was desperately wrong. The headaches came in waves, pounding behind my eyes like my brain was shrinking inside my skull. These weren't normal headaches. They felt like my brain was being squeezed by invisible hands, compressed until I could barely think straight. The pain would build slowly, starting as a dull ache and then escalating into something that made me want to press my palms against my temples and scream. Sometimes the pain was so intense that I'd see spots, little flashes of light that danced across my vision, but the worst part wasn't physical. It was how my mind started fixating on the most disturbing thoughts. My brain had become this twisted thing that I couldn't control, generating ideas that would have horrified me just weeks earlier. I'd find myself studying the others with a new kind of attention, noticing things that made my stomach turn with shame. The way Roberto's arms still had some meat on them, how Carlos's cheeks hadn't hollowed out as much as the rest of us. As Roberto Canessa would later describe, these thoughts grew slowly in our minds, requiring constant compartmentalization to function. These observations would creep into my mind without warning, and I'd try to push them away, but they kept coming back stronger each time. I'd catch myself staring at Roberto's arms, wondering what they might taste like, then immediately hate myself for thinking it. The thought would hit me like a physical blow, so sudden and graphic that I'd actually gasp. I'd imagine the texture, the flavor, how it might feel between my teeth, and then the revulsion would crash over me like a wave. The shame was almost as painful as the hunger itself. I'd spend hours afterward trying to scrub those thoughts from my mind, but they'd already taken root somewhere deep in my brain, growing stronger every day. Sleep became impossible because every dream was about food, but not normal food, raw, bloody, forbidden food. I'd close my eyes and immediately be transported to these vivid nightmares where I was eating things that made me wake up screaming. The dreams were so real that I could taste blood in my mouth when I woke up, metallic and warm. Sometimes I'd dream about eating my own flesh, peeling strips of skin from my arms and chewing them like jerky. The dreams were graphic, horrible visions that left me feeling sick with guilt even though I hadn't actually done anything. My saliva production went haywire, my mouth watering at the strangest times, as if my body was preparing for something my mind couldn't accept. I'd be sitting there trying to have a normal conversation and suddenly my mouth would flood with saliva for no reason at all. It was like my body knew something my conscious mind was still fighting. The excess saliva would pool under my tongue and I'd have to swallow constantly to keep from drooling. It was humiliating and terrifying at the same time, this physical response to thoughts I was trying so hard to suppress. I realized later that this wasn't weakness or madness. It was my survival instinct systematically breaking down every moral barrier I'd ever built. My body was preparing me for something that my civilized mind couldn't accept yet. Every physical symptom, every disturbing thought, every moment of moral revulsion was part of this process. As Pedro Algorta would later explain, survival eating was not from a rational decision, rather from an instinctive imperative. My body understood what needed to happen long before my mind was ready to accept it. The person I'd been before the crash was disappearing, replaced by something primitive and desperate that I barely recognized. I was becoming something new, something that could think unthinkable thoughts and feel things that should have been impossible. And then, when our last scraps of leather finally ran out, I found myself facing a moment that would change everything forever. The moment everything changed. There's a specific moment when you cross a line you never thought existed, and for me it happened when I found myself standing over Carlos's body after the avalanche on day 17. I can still see him lying there in the snow, his face peaceful in a way that made my chest tighten with grief. Carlos had been struggling more than the rest of us, his body giving up the fight against starvation faster than we'd expected. When I woke up that morning and saw him motionless beside me, I knew immediately that he was gone. The silence that followed wasn't just sadness, it was something much more complicated, something that made my stomach clench with emotions I couldn't name. I need you to understand that when conventional food finally ran out completely around day 4, we didn't just get hungrier, we entered a different reality. The last crumbs of chocolate had been consumed, picked from the cracks in the plane's floor with desperate fingers. We'd scraped every surface clean, searching for any trace of something edible. The reality of our situation hit us like a physical blow when we realized there was literally nothing left from the original supplies. We'd moved beyond hunger into something that felt like dying from the inside out. We'd been surviving on leather from the plane seats, boiled into a tasteless soup that barely kept us alive. The result was this gray, rubbery liquid that tasted like cardboard and did almost nothing to fill the growing emptiness in our stomachs. But standing there, looking down at Carlos, who died in his sleep, something clicked in my brain like a switch being flipped. The thought that had been circling the edges of my consciousness for weeks suddenly moved to the center, clear and undeniable. I felt this strange combination of horror and relief, as if a question I'd been afraid to ask had finally been answered. My body seemed to understand what my mind was still struggling to process. The shaking in my hands stopped for the first time in days. and I felt this weird sense of calm that scared me more than the panic had. The thought that had been lurking in the shadows for weeks suddenly became crystal clear and undeniable. I looked at Carlos's body and saw something that wasn't just my friend anymore. The person I'd laughed with, shared stories with, worried about, that Carlos was gone. What remained was something else, something that could solve our most desperate problem. The transformation in my thinking was so complete and so sudden that I almost didn't recognize myself. It was like watching someone else's thoughts appear in my head, thoughts that belonged to a different person entirely. I felt my mouth water, actually water, and the shame of that physical response was almost worse than the thought itself. The saliva pooled under my tongue before I could stop it, my body responding to an idea that my conscious mind was still fighting. I tried to swallow it back, to make the physical reaction go away, but it was too late. My body had already decided what my brain was still trying to reject. The betrayal of my own physical response made me want to scream, but I couldn't make any sound at all. The others were thinking it too. I could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided looking directly at the body. Roberto stood with his hands clenched into fists, his jaw working silently as if he was chewing on words he couldn't say. Nando kept glancing at Carlos and then looking away quickly like he'd been caught doing something shameful. We all moved differently around the body, keeping our distance but not really moving away. There was this horrible tension in the air, like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. We stood in silence for what felt like hours, each of us waiting for someone else to say what we were all thinking. The wind howled around us, but inside our shelter, the quiet was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the others breathing, could hear the small sounds our bodies made as we shifted nervously. Nobody wanted to be the first to break the silence, to give voice to the thought that was consuming all of us. When someone finally spoke those words, "We're going to have to eat them," the relief was immediate and horrifying. I don't even remember who said it first, but the sound of those words hanging in the air made my knees weak. The relief wasn't about the decision itself, it was about finally admitting what we'd already known for days. This was our pact to honor the dead, the only way we could frame what we were about to do and still remain human. We'd been dancing around the truth, pretending there might be another way, but hearing it spoken out loud stripped away all the pretense. Because in that moment I realized we'd already made the decision days ago. We just hadn't admitted it to ourselves yet. The decision hadn't been made in that instant when someone spoke the words. It had been made gradually, piece by piece, as our bodies and minds adapted to what survival actually required. Now we had to face what came next. The taste of survival. The moment had arrived with a finality that made my entire body shake, not from cold this time, but from the knowledge that I was about to become someone completely different. Nothing could have prepared me for what it actually felt like to take that first bite, or how my body would react to crossing the ultimate taboo. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened when we finally acted on our desperation, because the reality was nothing like what you might imagine. There's no movie or book that captures what it's really like to cross that line, to move from being a normal person into something that civilization doesn't have a name for. We'd spent hours talking about it in hushed voices, circling around the decision like vultures, each of us waiting for someone else to take the first step. The preparation was methodical, almost clinical. We had to distance ourselves from what we were actually doing to function. Roberto, who had some medical knowledge, took charge of the process with a calm efficiency that scared me. As he would later recall, it was a day colder and grayer than any before or since when he made that first incision. He explained that we needed to cut the flesh into thin strips, laying them aside on a piece of sheet metal we'd salvaged from the plane. The methodical approach wasn't just practical, it was psychological armor, a way to make this unspeakable act feel more like a medical procedure than what it really was. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife, but my stomach was cramping with anticipation. The first piece looked so small, almost innocent, but putting it in my mouth felt like swallowing my own soul. I held it between my fingers for what felt like hours, this tiny strip of flesh that represented everything I'd never thought I could become. The moment it touched my tongue, I knew there was no going back to who I used to be. The texture was tougher than I expected, and the taste, as Eduardo Strauch later described it, was tough and odorless, neutral to the senses. There was no distinctive flavor, no overwhelming sensation that would have made it easier or harder to swallow. The lack of taste was almost worse than if it had been horrible, because it meant I had to confront what I was doing without any sensory distraction. It was just meat, plain and simple, and that realization hit me harder than any strong flavor could have. My body's response was immediate and conflicting. Nausea mixed with desperate hunger, revulsion fighting with relief. Part of me wanted to spit it out immediately, but another part of me, the part that had been starving for weeks, responded with gratitude so intense it made me dizzy. I started crying while I chewed, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of what I was becoming. The tears weren't about grief or loss. They were about transformation, about watching myself become something that my former self would have found horrifying. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. As Roberto Canessa explained, this was a final goodbye to innocence, and I felt that loss in every cell of my body. The person I had been before the crash was gone, not gradually but all at once, in the space of a single bite. I could feel the old me disappearing, taking with her all the assumptions and beliefs that had defined my entire life up to that point. But here's the thing that still haunts me. After that first bite, it got easier, and that terrified me more than anything. As survivors would later testify, the second bite required less mental struggle, the psychological barriers breaking down with frightening speed. The third piece went down with even less resistance. My body was adapting faster than my mind could process, accepting this new reality with an efficiency that made my skin crawl. Within hours, what had seemed impossible was becoming routine, and that transformation scared me more than the act itself. My body had crossed a line that my mind was still struggling to process, and there was no going back to who I used to be. The horror wasn't in the act itself, it was in how quickly I became someone who could do it without thinking. But what I didn't realize then was that this was just the beginning of a much deeper transformation that would reshape everything about how we related to each other and to ourselves. How hunger rewrote our humanity. The speed of our transformation was breathtaking. Within days of crossing that first terrible line, I watched all of us become strangers to ourselves, operating according to rules that hadn't existed in our previous lives. What I'm about to tell you will show you how extreme hunger doesn't just change what you eat, it fundamentally rewrites who you are as a human being. Over the following weeks, I watched our entire group transform into something that would have been unrecognizable to our former selves. The polite teenagers who had boarded that plane in Montevideo were gone, replaced by beings who functioned according to instincts we didn't even know we possessed. Our voices changed first. They became flatter, more mechanical, as if expressing emotion was too expensive for our depleted systems. We moved differently too, with the careful precision of predators conserving energy for the hunt. Every gesture became calculated, every word measured against the cost of speaking it. We developed a system, rules, almost like a twisted etiquette around what we were doing to maintain some semblance of civilization. Roberto took charge of the cutting, using his medical knowledge to determine the best methods. We established protocols about who would prepare the flesh, how it would be distributed, even how we would talk about it. The word meat became our euphemism, stripping away the human connection that might have made our actions impossible. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were psychological armor, protecting us from the full weight of what we'd become. The distribution system became almost ritualistic. We'd sit in a circle the same way we used to share stories about home, but now we were sharing something that had once been one of us. Each person received their portion with the same quiet gratitude they might have shown for communion wine. Nobody spoke during these silent distribution ceremonies. The silence wasn't reverent, it was necessary, because words would have made the reality too concrete to bear. Friendships took on new meanings when your survival literally depended on the death of others. I found myself looking at my closest friends with a complex mixture of love and something darker. When Susanna got sick, part of me was genuinely terrified of losing her, but another part, a part that made me sick with shame, was already calculating what her death might mean for the rest of us. These weren't conscious thoughts at first. They crept in like shadows, polluting relationships that had once been pure and uncomplicated. The bonds between us strengthened in some ways and warped in others. We became fiercely protective of each other, but also hyper-aware of each other's physical condition. We'd study each other's faces during conversations, noting who still had fat in their cheeks, whose arms retained muscle mass. Yet this calculation coexisted with genuine love and the shared empathy that kept our group cohesive. I started having conversations with the dead bodies, apologizing to them, thanking them, asking for forgiveness. This wasn't madness. It was the only way I could process what we were doing to people who had been laughing with us just days before. I'd kneel beside each body before we prepared it, whispering apologies that felt both necessary and completely inadequate. "I'm sorry, Carlos," I'd whisper. "Thank you for keeping us alive." As Ramon Sabella would later explain, we began to see our friends as organ donors, people who were giving us the gift of life through their death. These dialogues became essential rituals that helped me maintain some connection to the person I used to be. Without them, I think I would have lost myself completely in the mechanics of survival. The dead became my confessors, the only ones who could understand the weight of what we were carrying. I'd tell them about my dreams, my fears, my gratitude for their sacrifice. In those moments, they felt more real to me than the living. Food became our entire universe. Every conversation, every thought, every prayer centered around this one desperate need. We stopped talking about home, about the future, about anything that existed beyond the immediate question of sustenance. Our world had shrunk to the size of our stomachs, and everything else felt like luxury we couldn't afford. Dreams, hopes, memories, all of it became secondary to the crushing reality of hunger. As Roberto Canessa would later reflect, this transformation represented a profound reframing. I thought if I would die, I would be proud that my body would be used for someone else. Death had become generosity, consumption had become gratitude, and survival had become a sacred duty to honor those who had given us life. We were still human, but we were a different kind of human, one that had been forged by circumstances most people couldn't imagine. Our humanity hadn't disappeared. It had been compressed, distilled down to its most essential elements. What remained was love, determination, and an unshakable commitment to keeping each other alive, no matter what that required. But what I didn't understand then was how deeply this transformation would follow me long after we left those mountains. The weight of every bite. Even now, decades later, I can't eat a simple meal without feeling the weight of what I consumed in those mountains. The fork feels heavy in my hand, each bite loaded with memories that most people will never have to carry. I'll sit at my kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday morning, spreading jam on toast, and suddenly I'm 17 again, standing in that frozen wasteland where every morsel meant the difference between life and death. The jam tastes too sweet, almost cloying, and I find myself thinking about how we would have treasured even a single drop of that sweetness during those 72 days. This compulsion to savor every bite, to never waste even a crumb, is something Eduardo Strauss and other survivors have described, our bodies remembering what it felt like to be truly empty. I want you to understand that surviving the Andes didn't end when we were rescued. It changed how I relate to food forever. The helicopter that pulled us from that mountain carried away our bodies, but it couldn't lift the psychological weight we'd accumulated during those months of starvation. Every meal since then has been filtered through the lens of what I learned about hunger, about desperation, about the things human beings will do to stay alive. The simple act of eating became complicated in ways I'm still trying to understand. Every meal now carries the memory of that desperate hunger, the knowledge of what I was capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. I can't abide leftovers. Watching people abandon perfectly good food triggers something visceral in me that I can't control. I find myself unable to waste even a single bite, compulsively saving every scrap of vegetable, using bones for stock, scraping every last bit of sauce from the pan. This isn't just thriftiness, it's a documented coping mechanism among survivors, a way our bodies remember the sensation of our stomachs folding in on themselves. But it's more than just appreciation. It's a constant reminder of the person I became up there. Every bite carries the weight of what I've done, what I've tasted, what I've become capable of. When I chew, I'm reminded of the texture of that first forbidden meal, the way it felt between my teeth. The memory isn't just mental, it's physical, embedded in my jaw muscles, my tongue, my throat. Sometimes I'll be eating something completely ordinary like chicken or beef, and suddenly I'm transported back to that moment when I crossed the line from civilized person to something else entirely. Sometimes I'll be eating dinner with my family, and suddenly I'm back in those mountains, tasting something I can never forget. The transition happens without warning, triggered by some unconscious association that I can't predict or control. The dining room will fade away, replaced by the metallic walls of our makeshift shelter. The warm food in my mouth becomes that first strip of human flesh, tough and neutral, and I'll stop chewing mid-bite. My family has learned to recognize these moments, the way my face changes, the way I set down my fork and stare at nothing. The guilt isn't about what we did to survive, it's about how easily my body adapted, how quickly the unthinkable became routine. This is what haunts me most. Not the act itself, but the speed with which I transformed from someone who would have been horrified by the idea to someone who could do it without hesitation. Within days, what had seemed impossible became natural. My body embraced this new reality with an efficiency that terrifies me even now. The survivors I've spoken with over the years carry this same weight. Eduardo Strauss told me it took 3 years for his periodic bouts of depression to subside, and that writing about the experience 40 years later served as a positive catharsis. Carlos Paez described his struggle with addiction as la montaña más dura, the hardest mountain, stating that getting out of drugs was more difficult than surviving in the mountain. His 27 years in recovery highlight how the trauma follows us long after the rescue helicopters have gone home. I've spent years trying to reconcile the person I was before with the person who emerged from that frozen hell. I can't go back to that innocent version of myself. Can't pretend that I haven't seen what humans are capable of when everything else is stripped away. The truth is that experience didn't just save my life, it revealed something about human nature that most people never have to confront. Every bite I take now is both a celebration of survival and a reminder of the price we paid to earn it. Food isn't just sustenance, it's a daily confrontation with the most profound choice I've ever made. And what that choice taught me about the person I really am when everything familiar gets stripped away. The next time you feel your stomach growl, remember that hunger isn't just about food. It's about discovering who you really are when everything else is stripped away. What happened in the Andes taught me that the line between civilization and survival is thinner than we'd like to believe. We tell ourselves we're above our animal instincts, but when push comes to shove, we discover what we're actually capable of.